3, 2, 1. Hell yeah. Welcome to our mighty return in the Pickle Boys podcast after like 3 weeks. Been a long 3 weeks, so like it was a lot of work. I'm just gonna say that. I'm gonna leave it at that. Unless you guys want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, we were just finishing up our finals, making sure that we're gonna get into college, and we just had to put Pickle Boys on pause due to all the stress. But now we're back, stronger than ever, with some mighty topics to discuss. And I hope you guys are ready because it's just gonna be so epic.
Let's just jump into it.
Okay. Yep. Jump.
Okay. Thankfully, in today's world, there's a lot of things that occur to talk about.
Thankfully,
a lot of bad things happen, so we can talk about it right now.
Everything has its pro and its cons. It's not black and white. There's always gray in between.
I'm
talking about black and white.
Oh my god.
No, that's a segue right there. I didn't even think about that.
While we were completing our finals, there was a very terrible occurrence, which was the death and the killing of George Floyd, who apparently was buying something at a local store with a $20 counterfeit bill, and that led him to being killed, being suffocated for 8 minutes by a police officer, with bystanders, with other police officers around. No one really taking a stand to stop the police officer. And this has created a cataclysmic amount of events which have culminated into hundreds of thousands of protests across the United States, across the world, protesting racism in the US, protesting racism around the world, and basically just trying to spread the point that Black Lives Matter and that police brutality and all of the effects of slavery that are still in our world and in our civilization today are still occurring, and they are still affecting a very large portion of our community.
Well, for the podcast, for guest, we couldn't find any white supremacist to give his points of view. So, I mean,
the closest thing we have is Ugo.
Just because I'm the Franco guy doesn't mean I'm a white supremacist. There's two different things.
I know it's
there can be dark-skinned fascists as well.
Yes,
okay?
Yeah. That was kind of racist, dude.
Why?
Because you're not supposed to say dark-skinned.
What's the difference between saying dark-skinned and black? And if something dark-skinned to me sounds even more respectful.
Well, we live in two different worlds, Hugo.
Oh, you're American, that's right.
You should have said.
In my country, all we care about is women's right. No, there's like no racial issues.
Actually.
Yeah, actually, nobody. The only protests that I've seen about racial issues in Spain were led by illegal immigrants. So like they didn't get any traction.
Right. Well, let's not talk about Spain today.
Because you're the protagonist today.
No, Ugo, I'm always the protagonist. So, Lucas, would you like to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter and the movement that has been created basically to combat police brutality and systemic racism in the United States?
I think that the movement itself, it's, from my personal point of view, I find it very important. And I think that's something that is a movement that we should have, and a movement that should have its importance. It's something that we also need to focus on, and something that we need to, I think that every member in every community needs to support this movement so we can get across it and make sure that what they're fighting for is not a problem longer in the future. Now, it's been the Black Lives Matter movements have sparked a lot of protests, and I think that the protests are correct. I think that people should go to the streets and people should be there should be some civil disobedience. However, I also do think that there's a line. I remember that when the protest starts and that are still ongoing, I remember that there are a lot of videos showing that there were some looting, some stores, looting affecting, for example, the local economy. There's also looting and destroying vehicles, putting things on fire. And I think that that's when the violence become protest and they reach that extreme in which it's not just civil disobedience, but it's violence and putting others at risks. I think that that's where you have to draw the line.
Ugo, do you
I
have
mean,
anything?
I'm sure that all sane people, or like normal people, to say it some way, agree that the message that the movement tries to get across, it's a positive one, and one that we all have to agree with. However, the execution of the movement, especially in the U.S., is iffy at best, horrible at worst, because at the end of the day, people might see the looting and the whatever you want to call the robberies and etc. as more as kind of reasons why they shouldn't actually support the movement. I see a lot of people getting into that train of thought that why would I support this movement if all they do is loot and rob the stores that I own and that or that are in my community or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. But also when we talk about the violence and the looting of the protests, I think that we also have to keep in mind that the people who are making this looting and making all of this violence is not necessarily the people who are fighting for the movement. You can have people who are taking advantage of these protests and the civil disobedience to loot and gain and get something for their own sake. And you can also have people from the other side trying to sabotage the protests to have exactly what Hugo was saying. Having saying, why would I join this protest? Why would I support this movement if they're going to the streets and they just destroyed the business of this one guy who spent a whole day protesting for this cause? What is that meaning? Having all of this violence, it completely changes the whole meaning of the movement and the perception of it. And so when we talk about all of this violence and this looting, we have to be very careful on how we're explaining it and how we're perceiving it, because it may not be of the people who are involved in the movement itself, but other people for their own personal and selfish motives.
Yeah, I think there are three main problems with the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment. One, of course, there's a very small minority of people who are looting and rioting and really destroying local communities, destroying local businesses, and showing the conservative world that really it's just a bunch of criminals who are faking honoring George Floyd and all of the victims of police brutality just so that they can get a little bit richer, just so that they can rob a store and get something that they wanted to buy but they didn't have enough money for. That's point one. Point two is that they're aligning themselves with organizations which have now been labeled as terrorist organizations such as Antifa and Anonymous. So while Anonymous is a little bit more groundbreaking than Antifa. Antifa is a violent movement. It is definitely a terrorist organization, and they are very much so against the concept of the United States and the Western world. They want to go back to a Soviet era style. And for anybody who knows history, we all know that in both major communist revolutions, the Soviet Union and in China, there were tens of millions of deaths, victims who did not agree with the cause, who were bludgeoned, killed, raped, tortured. That's because they didn't believe in the communist way or form. And lastly, they don't have a clear leader. And the fact that they don't have a clear leader, a clear spokesperson, basically says that the movement aligns themselves with an anarchic type of way. It's saying that since there is no leader, Black Lives Matter can basically do whatever they want. The press has no one to talk to because there is no spokesperson who speaks for Black Lives Matter as a whole. And if you don't have a leader, you're not going to get anywhere, because one of the main points, and I cannot stress this enough, one of the main ways that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was able to get across to the opposing side and change legislation for good was that they had Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his associates around going to the White House, going to Congress, going to the Senate, going to the Supreme Court, going to every local government in the U.S. who had a history of racism and discrimination against the Black community, and they were talking and they were getting their point across in a diplomatic fashion. And this is definitely not what the Black Lives Matter movement has evolved into, because they have just completely, from my perspective, they have lost hope that they can do things in a systemic and diplomatic way, and they have decided that the only way to get their point across is to do these riots and align themselves with these people. And of course, obviously, you have these rioters and looters who are also giving them a bad rap, and the conservative media eats that up, and they they bring that propaganda to the news every day. And obviously, people who don't look outside of Fox News or Breitbart only see that kind of stuff, and they see, wow, the Black Lives Matter movement is violent, and they're basically trying to take away some of our rights. So why should I support them?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think that they do have, at least, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, it's a movement, and within there's different groups. And I think that essentially the one who's going to get the furthest point, like we can see, like in the civil rights movement, is the one that's the most organized. For example, like Martin Luther King, he was really organized, and they had something settled, and they can have discussions. But something that I found very interesting, or something like very important within the civil rights movement, is the presence of Malcolm X. Although Malcolm X, he was more extremist, and he was an advocate for Black supremacy, and at the same time, when he talks about violence, he doesn't mean to say first way to use it, but if somebody is, like, for example, attacking you, you should attack back. You should defend yourself. And I think that having that sort of presence and that group of his own movement within the whole movement, it was very key, because the government, when it came to negotiate, they said, okay, I'm not going to go for Malcolm X, because Malcolm X, he won't listen to me. So I'm going to go for someone who's more organized, someone who's more, let's say, not as extreme. And I'm going to go for Martin Luther King. So I think that that's something very interesting to highlight. And then another thing that you said, Andres, it was about the last part. You were talking about the reason of why the movement is kind of seem like as like an anarchy and is associating with these sort of groups. I think that the Black community has been fed up a lot, and this is something that I talked in my global politics class with my teacher. He is he's an African American. He's from Canada, and he's Black, and he was talking to us, and he said that from his personal perspective, that every single Black man should sign up for the rifle NRFA, is it?
NRA?
Yeah.
National Rifle Association. Yeah.
National Rifle Association, because he was saying that when a white cop or any cop at all comes and arrests a Black man, they should fear, knowing that there will be severe consequences, knowing that all of them are armed, that all of them are feared. And I personally, when I hear that, after hearing his whole rationale, I can see what he's trying to get to. But I personally think that if we fight fear with fear, we're going to get into a situation. I'm afraid of reaching a situation like LA had in the 80s and the 90s, that sort of tension. And because now there's so much more technology and this movement has been globalized all across the world, I'm afraid of that sort of tension that was extremely high, not only to belong to one city like LA, but to be across a whole nation and across the whole globe. That's one of my biggest worries when the violence when the whole movement gets violent, let's say.
No, the worst thing that this movement could do is get more violent than it already is, because it just gives more ideas to conservative medias and even neutrals that this movement is actually toxic. That if you combat fire with fire in these sort of situations, the only thing you're gonna do is burn up more stuff. There's no way this escalates if you give if you take such an aggressive measure as doing that.
I agree with your point, but I don't like the way you phrase that, Hugo, because for the most part, the protests have been very peaceful in nature, and the only times that they have escalated have been when there are counter protesters who have entered the protest and have incited violence within the protest. And of course, this is basic human psychology. When you're in a human mob, there's going to be an escalation of violence once provoked. You can see this in the Bible. You can see this in one of the famous classical Spanish works, Fuente Ovejuna. And I think something that we really have to consider is that people are fed up, just as Lucas said, just as your teacher, Mr. Heil, said. And when people are fed up, they want change. And when they see that change can't happen by doing it in a diplomatic fashion, then obviously they're going to have to resort to more aggressive measures. And aggressive measures doesn't necessarily mean violence. Aggressive measures, it means doing the stuff that the Black Lives Matter movement has been doing, which has been creating a global conversation. I think one of the most important things about this movement, and I don't agree completely with the nature of the movement and how it has evolved into being a little bit more anarchy-based and very leftist and very not open to discussion with other perspectives and other people who could possibly join. But one of the main things is that information is power. And if you can spread the message that there is a sort of racism which is ingrained into the white man of the United States, and you can spread that and you can prove that through these videos such as George Floyd being killed, or the two recent killings in Atlanta to basically Black men who are unarmed and who are scared to death. You can really start a global conversation, and you can really promote a more aggressive style of protesting because it is justified in this sense.
Andres, I want to ask you something, because you know a lot about. Out of the three of us, you're the one who knows most about U.S. politics. How do you think that the George Floyd event and the increase in the protests would have altered the Democratic nomination? Do you think there would have been any change? Would it have been a tighter race, or Joe Biden would have that much of a gap with
Bernie?
With Bernie?
Yeah. So if this had happened earlier in the year, well, I think we need to consider a lot of factors here. Two main factors. The first one is that Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination. Well, is going to win it because of a corrupt democratic system. The DNC is definitely corrupt and was definitely wanting Joe Biden to be their nominee. And this can be most clearly seen in the fact that in Texas, which is a state that Bernie Sanders was winning on Super Tuesday, there were clear accounts of voter suppression towards people of color and Latinos because, well, Joe Biden knows that those people are the ones who vote for Bernie Sanders. And so that's the first point to consider. The second point to consider is the whole deal with the coronavirus. I think Trump's way of handling the coronavirus was ineffective, and I think a lot of people in the United States have started to realize that. And because of the way that his administration has handled many significant events in the past, we could see that this was basically a tipping point. This was, and I hate to put it this way because George Floyd's death was definitely not how I'm about to metaphorize it, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And these protests, the size and the magnitude of these protests don't come out of nowhere. So obviously there was a lot of pent-up anger, there was a lot of frustration in the American people, which led them to this point of protest, to this place where they feel like their voices have to be heard, that they're protesting for what is now almost a month, 4 days away from a month. But I still don't think that this would have altered the course of the Democratic nomination at all. I think Joe Biden was the clear candidate for the Democrats from the get-go, and I think that most Democratic candidates, such as Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, and basically everyone else who dropped out, they dropped out at a strategic moment so that all of their votes would go to Joe Biden, and so that Bernie Sanders would be alienated and would not be able to win the nomination properly. So I don't think these protests would have had a grave effect on the Democratic nomination at all. However, I do think that it is a great way to campaign for Joe Biden if he hadn't been such a conformist and establishment politician for his whole career.
I think that also with Biden, I'm going to ask you this question. And we can see right now in the US, there's the feminist movement, and now there's the Black Lives Movement. And I was just going to ask you if, who do you think is who do you think that Joe Biden is going to ask for his VP with all the movements that are happening in the US?
I know
I
that
was gonna make a joke, but maybe it's a bit too much.
Yeah, well, I know that Amy Klobuchar dropped out of the VP race because she said, "Put a woman of color on the ballot," which I thought was kind of funny.
Oh yeah, that was the joke I was gonna make.
Yeah. So I'm guessing it's going to be a woman of color, and based off that, if I were Joe Biden, I would pick Tulsi Gabbard because I feel like she would have the biggest outreach. She's a former servicewoman. She served in the U.S. military in the Iraq War. She's from Hawaii. She's more of a centrist, and she has a lot of Republican supporters, believe it or not, because she has such a large social media agglomeration.
Presence.
Yeah, social media presence. She actually probably has around the same amount of Republican supporters as Democratic supporters. So I think she would be a really good nominee. I think she would be a really good ally for Joe Biden. But I don't think the Democrats are very smart strategists at all. So I don't think they're going to pick the right nominee at VP nominee.
I'm gonna vote you for president in 4 years.
I'm too young.
How old do you have to be? You're gonna
35,
be 18.
right?
35, yeah.
35, yeah.
Those age restrictions are crap. Why the hell would you restrict the age of your president? Who cares?
Goo goo gaga.
Yo, imagine that. An underage becoming president. That would be
epic, bro.
that would be epic. Imagine all the memes that would come out of that.
Will we get more memes than Trump's
honestly,
presidency?
It would be really cool to have like a young president that's not married. Like, it's time for the presidential bachelor, and it's like it's like 8 weeks of the president choosing his wife.
So basically like JFK without Jackie.
Exactly. Tonight we're going on a date with Marilyn Monroe, but we're not telling our current wife and children.
Hey,
Yeah,
what were we talking about? Vice president?
Matter. What?
What?
So, what do you guys think of the All Lives Matter movement, and how do you think this affects voter opinion?
I mean, it's not got half as much traction as the Black Lives Matter movement because I feel like other people tend to have the predisposition or like feel like the Black Lives Matter movement somehow is more important, and it's more important to put like it's kind of similar to the feminist movement, where the feminist movement tries to undermine man and bring up women. That's what truly the feminist movement should try to do is put them equal with each other. And that's the difference, in my opinion, between the Black Lives movement and the All Lives Matter movement, because the Black Lives Matter movement is more, let's say, aggressive towards white people. It paints them more as an evil person, or as the root of all evil in America, while the All Lives Matter movement is more of a it shows more that it understands that not all white people are bad, and that it's not that only Black lives matter, it's that all of our lives matter because we are all deserving of the same rights and the same opportunities, no matter our skin color.
Okay, Will. But I don't think that's the purpose of the yeah, that is the purpose, but it's like in my opinion, it's just like a finger in the eye to the Black Lives Matter movement. Because if you look at statistics from anywhere, you can see that the African American community has been the community which has suffered the most in the United States from 1600 to till today. They're still the group who's in the most poverty. They're the group that that basically can't leave poverty. They're the group which has to deal with the most violence. They have the most premature deaths. They have the most drug deaths. It's really unfortunate. And I think what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to say is that, okay, yeah, we acknowledge that all lives matter, but based on the rhetoric, based on the context of American society and the inability for politicians who say that they are on your side to do nothing basically about the situation which has been going on for centuries. It's basically just saying that Black Lives Matter and you have to change, you have to do something so that there is a sort of equality, so that Black children, the next generation of African Americans, are allowed to basically have their lives matter in the same way that white districts and predominantly white districts get benefits. I don't like the last part I said. I don't think I explained that well. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a clear divide between races and their economic economic opportunities and wealth. And Blacks have always been on the bottom of that ladder. So, and this isn't just economic, obviously. This is social as well.
Yeah.
And this is political because they don't get many representatives in Congress or in the Senate. There's only three senators who are Black in the U.S. Senate, and there are 13% African Americans in the U.S. Same with Latinos, but that's not the conversation. So I think what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to do is just call attention to the fact that African Americans haven't had the rights, they haven't had the benefits that a normal American person deserves and should get, because there is the American dream, and that is why people come to the United States. And obviously, African Americans didn't decide to come to the United States. They were brought here on slave ships. So they're basically in a place where they are not from, that they did not choose to come from for the most part. And they are suffering to this day from the drawbacks and from the legislation of slavery.
Yeah, I agree with Andres is saying. Like, of course, all lives matter. I think that's one of the things that the Black Lives Matter is trying to call attention to. As Andres said, there's a massive gap there's a massive economic, social, political gap in between both races. And as Andres was saying, the Blacks are always at the bottom, they're always below. And although they might have they don't have the same rights, and although they may have the same rights, they're not treated with the same rights. They're not treated with the same respect. They're not treated the same way, and they're denied a lot of stuff. And I think that they're oppressed in several scenarios. And I think that the Black Lives Matter is trying to work towards that whole all lives matter by calling attention to their situation, to calling attention that they're not of what they're experiencing. And although and I feel that sometimes when people say if you say that all Black Lives Matters and they say all lives matters, yeah, that's the point. And I think that we need to I personally think that we need to have the Black Lives Matter should be the movement that we use. They just have to organize themselves and have a more have a direction so that they're not just like doing whatever, so they don't go have different groups doing different things, come together, have a leader, find a direction, work for something, and it should be Black Lives Matter. Because by saying all lives matter, I sometimes feel that some people are saying it's like maybe postpone change, or saying like, yeah, all lives matter, so we can't just give you all of this because we also gotta worry about us. But by worrying all about us and going like this, it's why we're in the situation right now. And the movement is calling to have that all lives matters argument. It's calling and it's rising from that idea. It's just saying Black lives matter because they're being inferior. They're experiencing this and nobody's doing anything about it. It's like, es como ponerlo así como, like, como el póster. It's not really being done. And I think that that's why I don't like the wording, although I understand the all lives matters, I'm not in favor for it entirely. I'm more leaning towards Black Lives Matter.
Okay, we just hit the 30-minute mark. So if you guys want to make it this a shorter one than usual, we could just put our last few points out there and then finish it.
I only have one last question that I want to ask you guys.
Okay.
How do you think that Trump has responded towards the situation? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, just have been way too aggressive for my liking. Like the way he described some of the events, he showed clear, like he was very polarizing what he did, and very aggressive. And I feel like it maybe some people feel like what he did was necessary, but I believe that like the actions he took and how aggressive he was towards some of the protests, what they ended up doing is proving the protesters that their points were right, and it eventually backfired to him and what he was trying to do from the beginning. So I think like in overall he handled it horribly. It was kind of hard to do a worse job than what he did.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think that's really highlighted when he made a speech. It was I think it was a couple of days after George Floyd's death. He was holding a press conference where he said that he supports peaceful protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement, and that he's going to visibly support them. And basically, at exactly the same time frame, exactly the same time to the second, the military, well, not the military, but the DC police were clearing out protesters with tear gas and with rubber bullets, just so that he could walk to a church and hold up a Bible,
and take a picture,
which I'm pretty sure he's never read. And I think that basically just sums up the Trump presidency, where it's just like so much hypocrisy, taking credit where it's undeserved, and just basically being a fraudulent piece of poop who leads the American people.
Good to see your political views are very unbiased.
I mean, if there was another Republican president, I mean, if the other Republican nominees had become president, such as John Kasich or Jeb Bush or Rand Paul, I would probably be more supportive of them because they have an idea of human decency and what human rights actually are. Donald Trump, he does not embody what America says it embodies in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence.
I remember
but it's great for the memes. That's the most important part for me, an outsider. Fantastic.
I remember that a couple months ago when we were still in school, we were talking about Biden versus Trump and how Trump was gonna eventually win the presidential campaign. Do you think that with the protests and the movement that's happening right now, do you think that's the case, or does Biden have a better shot of winning right now?
Biden currently has a better shot of winning, but just wait until he opens his mouth and it's all going to go away. Donald Trump will be an incumbent president, 100%.
I also think that Trump's going to win again.
Yeah, I have very little faith for Joe Biden, and anyone who supports Joe Biden doesn't know one policy which he's proposed, because he proposes nothing. It's a disaster. American politics right now is a disaster. It's very corrupt. they should move away from a two-party system, in my opinion.
Yes, I agree. Two-party systems are actually quite toxic, but that's a good topic for another day.
That is true.
Okay, so if we're finished, that's the end of the podcast for today. Thank you for watching, and Andres, do the intro.
The
Outro.
outro. Oh,
Outro.
stupid. Make sure to tune into the Pickle Boys every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, depending on when Ugo wants to publish.
Thank you for watching. Let's just jump out of here very quick.
Whoa! Get sexy, bro.